The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting shadows that danced across the weathered walls of the ranch house. Outside, the Arizona night pressed against the windows, cold and vast. Inside, an old man sat in his chair, hands wrapped around a glass of whiskey that had gone warm in his grip. James Thornton was 72 years old. His hair had turned the color of winter wheat, and his hands bore the scars of a lifetime spent working land that never stopped demanding. But his eyes, they still held something bright, something that burned like embers refusing to die. Across from him, his grandson Thomas stuffed clothes into a worn canvas bag. 16 years old and hungry for the world beyond the fence line. The boy moved with the restless energy of youth, convinced that somewhere out there, life was waiting to happen. Jim watched him in silence. He'd seen that look before. Hell, he'd worn it himself once. "You all packed then?" Jim's voice carried the rough texture of a man who'd spent years speaking only when words mattered. Thomas looked up, guilt flickering across his young face. "Grandpa, the city's got jobs, real jobs, not just mending fences and chasing cattle." Jim nodded slowly. He took a sip of his whiskey, let it burn down his throat. The boy didn't understand. Not yet. But he would. They always did, eventually. "Before you leave this land, boy, you need to know why it's worth staying for." Jim set down his glass with deliberate care. "And why I nearly died protecting it 44 years ago." Thomas stopped packing. Something in his grandfather's tone had shifted. This wasn't going to be another lecture about responsibility or tradition. This was something else. Something the old man had kept buried for reasons Thomas couldn't yet grasp. "I ever tell you how I met your grandmother?" "You said you met her in Arizona, that she was Apache." "Oh, that's the simple version." Jim leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the fire. "The truth's a damn sight more complicated, and it starts with a choice I made when I was 28 years old. A choice that should have gotten me killed." The old man's eyes went distant, seeing something beyond the walls of the room, beyond the present moment, traveling back through decades to a time when the world was wilder, harder, and filled with the kind of consequences that left permanent marks on a man's soul. "Your grandmother used to say, 'Wisdom isn't knowing all the answers,'" Jim said quietly. "It's knowing which questions matter. And you're starting to ask the right questions, Thomas. But first, he's got to be willing to see it when it finds him." Thomas sat down on the edge of the bed, his packing forgotten. His grandfather had never spoken like this before, never opened this particular door. Jim reached for his whiskey again, but his hand trembled slightly. Not from age, from memory. September 1876. I was working for a rancher named Dutch Morrison, mean son of a bitch, who treated his horses worse than most men treat their enemies. I'd been saving every penny I could, trying to scrape together enough to buy my own land. $200. That's what I had. Wasn't enough for even 40 acres back then, but I kept hoping. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Morrison sent me out to find 5 missing steers, branded with his double T mark. Told me not to come back without them, or the money they were worth. I tracked those cattle for 3 days, following signs west along the San Pedro River. And that's when I crossed into territory I had no business entering. Thomas leaned forward. "Apache land?" "Sacred Apache land." Jim's voice dropped lower. "I saw the warning stones. Cairns, they're called. Rocks stacked in pyramids. Any man who'd spent time in Arizona territory knew what those meant. Turn back or accept the consequences. But I was young and stubborn, and convinced that 5 damn cows were worth the risk." The old man's jaw tightened. I was wrong. The room fell silent, except for the crackling fire. Thomas waited, barely breathing, as his grandfather stared into memories that still had the power to shake him. The woods west of the San Pedro weren't like other places. Trees grew thick and twisted, branches locking together like fingers trying to hold back the sky. It was the kind of place that made even seasoned men uneasy. And I rode right into it, following hoof prints in the soft earth, completely unaware that I wasn't alone. Jim closed his eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of reverence. She'd been tracking me since early morning, moving through those woods like smoke through a chimney, silent, patient. I didn't see her, didn't hear her, but she saw everything. The way I sat my horse, the way my hand rested near my rifle but never gripped it in fear. She was reading me the way a hunter reads prey, deciding whether I was dangerous or just ignorant. "Kaya," Thomas whispered. "Not yet." At that moment, she was just the woman who was going to decide whether I lived or died. Jim's hand unconsciously moved to his throat, fingers tracing a line where no scar showed, but memory remained. I should have felt her presence, should have trusted my instincts. But I was focused on those damn cattle tracks, blind to everything else. The fire cast long shadows as Jim continued. My horse knew, though. Animals always know. Dusty started getting nervous, ears twitching, nostrils flaring. That's when the birds went quiet. You ever been in woods where every bird stops singing at once? It's not natural. It's a warning. And I finally understood I'd made a terrible mistake. Thomas could picture the lonely cowboy on an anxious horse, surrounded by silent trees, finally realizing he'd walked into a trap. "She decided to test me," Jim said. A stone struck a tree to my left, sharp and sudden as a gunshot. Dusty reared up, and I wasn't ready. Got thrown like a greenhorn on his first ride. Hit the ground hard enough to knock the wind clean out of my lungs. Dust filled my mouth. I rolled onto my back, hand flying toward my gun. Jim paused, the memory still vivid after more than 4 decades. The blade touched my throat before my fingers reached the grip. Thomas's eyes widened. I froze. Above me stood a figure that looked half shadow, half spirit. She had eyes dark as midnight and just as unblinking. For a moment, I thought she might actually be a ghost, some kind of punishment sent by the land itself for my disrespect. But then I saw the knife. Obsidian. Black, volcanic glass, shaped into a blade sharper than any steel. That's when I knew she was real, and that I was about to die. The old man's voice grew softer. Many men would have begged. Many would have cursed or tried to fight. I did neither. I looked into her eyes and I said, "I'm not hunting you. I'm just lost." And I meant it. With that blade against my throat and death one quick motion away, I told her the truth. Jim opened his eyes, looking at his grandson with an intensity that made the boy sit up straighter. For a long moment, she searched my face for lies. I could see her weighing my words, deciding if they held any truth worth acknowledging. And then, slowly, the blade lifted away. She stepped back into the trees, vanishing like morning mist in sunlight. I lay there on my back for a long time after she was gone, staring up at the branches, trying to understand why I was still breathing. Thomas realized he'd been holding his breath. He let it out slowly. "Why did she spare you?" I didn't know. Not then. But lying there in the dust, I made a choice. I could run, get on my horse, ride back to Morrison's ranch, and never speak of what happened. Or I could stay, try to understand why this woman, this warrior, had given me a gift I didn't deserve. You stayed. I stayed. Jim's expression softened into something that might have been a smile. Not in her territory. I wasn't that foolish. But I made camp 200 yards from the boundary she'd set. And I built something. A small cairn of stones, stacked carefully just like the ones that had warned me away. It was an apology, a message in the only language I thought she might understand. I'm sorry. I see you now. I respect what you protect. The fire burned lower, but neither man moved to add wood. I didn't see her again that day, or the next, but on the third morning I found something on top of my cairn, a bundle of herbs tied with strips of bark, yarrow and willow, though I didn't know their names then. It was a message. I'm watching. You're no longer my enemy. Not yet. Jim's voice grew rougher with emotion. That's when the hunt changed, boy. She was no longer tracking me to kill me. She was watching to understand me. And without knowing it, I'd started watching for her too, looking for signs of her presence, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman who'd held my life in her hands and chosen mercy over vengeance. Thomas found himself drawn into the story despite his earlier eagerness to leave. His grandfather's words painted pictures more vivid than any he'd seen in the moving picture shows in town. On the fourth day, I saw something that changed everything. Jim's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. I was following a deer trail when I spotted a grave site, simple, marked with stones and a carved piece of wood. But next to it lay a small bow, a child's bow. And I understood. This wasn't just about protecting land. It was about protecting memory, about guarding the resting place of someone she'd loved and lost. The old man's voice cracked slightly. I knew that pain. My mother died when I was 8 years old. Fever took her in 3 days. The doctor wanted $20 to try to save her. I only had 8. I was 8 years old, and I watched my mother die because I couldn't find $12 more. I've carried that weight every day since. The guilt of not being enough, of failing the one person who mattered most. Thomas had never heard this story. His grandfather had never spoken of his childhood, of the losses that shaped him. So, when I saw that child's grave, Jim continued, I understood why she couldn't let strangers cross her land, why she couldn't trust men who looked like me, because I knew what it meant to lose someone and spend the rest of your life protecting their memory. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, but the room felt warmer somehow, as if the story itself generated heat. That evening, she appeared again, not with a knife this time. She simply walked out of the trees and sat down near my fire, far enough to run if needed, close enough to speak if she chose. Jim's expression softened with a tenderness that transformed his weathered features. I pointed toward the grave I'd seen, asked if the child was hers. She told me it was her brother, 16 years old, killed by men who'd come looking for gold that didn't exist. Men who looked like me, she said. Men who took what they wanted and left only grief behind. The old man paused, lost in the memory. I told her about my mother, about being 8 years old and helpless, about the weight of surviving when someone you love doesn't. And for the first time since we'd met, I saw something shift in her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. She saw her own pain reflected back at her. And that small connection, that shared understanding of loss. It created a bridge between two people who should have remained strangers. Jim looked at his grandson with eyes that had seen joy and sorrow in equal measure. She told me her name that night, Kaya. It means elder sister in Apache. She'd become that when her brother died, the protector, the guardian, the one who carried the weight of keeping others safe. Thomas heard the respect in his grandfather's voice, the awe. Even after 44 years, the memory of that moment still held power. And I told her mine, James, Jim. I said it didn't mean anything special, but she disagreed. She said all names mean something, because someone who loved you chose it. That made it special. That made it sacred. The old man fell silent for a moment, gathering himself for what came next. We talked until the fire burned low, about grief and duty and the weight of protecting things that others couldn't see the value in. And when she left that night, disappearing back into the darkness, I knew something fundamental had changed. I wasn't just a cowboy looking for lost cattle anymore. I was a man who'd been given a glimpse of something rare, someone who understood the cost of survival. Jim reached for his whiskey, found it empty, and set it aside. But the world doesn't stop just because two people find common ground, Thomas. 3 days later, everything I thought I understood got tested in ways I never imagined. And that test? That's when I learned what it really means to choose a side. To commit to something bigger than yourself, even when it might cost you everything. The old man's eyes met his grandson's, and Thomas saw something there he'd never noticed before. A depth of experience, a well of stories that ran deeper than he'd ever guessed. "You still want to leave in the morning?" Thomas looked at his packed bag, then back at his grandfather. "I want to hear the rest first." Jim nodded slowly. "Then pour yourself some coffee, boy, because what comes next? That's when the real story begins. That's when I stopped being a lost cowboy and became the man your grandmother chose to build a life with. And it started with me getting sick enough to die, and her making a choice that went against everything her grief had taught her." The fire crackled back to life as Thomas added wood, settling in for a story that would change how he saw everything. His grandfather, his grandmother, this land, and maybe, just maybe, his own future. Because sometimes the most important journeys don't take you away from home. Sometimes they teach you why home matters in the first place. Thomas poured coffee from the pot that had been sitting on the stove since supper. The liquid was thick and dark, bitter enough to strip paint. His grandfather liked it that way, said it kept a man honest. The old man accepted the cup with a nod of thanks, wrapping his gnarled fingers around the warmth. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the window panes. Inside, the fire cast dancing patterns across the walls, and James Thornton's voice filled the spaces between the shadows. 6 days after I met Kaya properly, after we'd sat by that fire and shared our grief like traders sharing goods, I woke up with a fever that felt like hellfire burning through my veins. Jim took a long sip of coffee, his eyes going distant again. Malaria. Though I didn't know that's what it was at the time, all I knew was that one morning I felt fine, and by noon I was shaking so hard I could barely stay in the saddle. The San Pedro River bred mosquitoes thick as fog in those days. Anopheles mosquitoes, the kind that carry the sickness in their bite. I must have gotten bit a dozen times without thinking twice about it. Thomas shifted in his seat, drawn deeper into the story. I tried to keep going. Stubborn pride, mostly. Thought I could just push through it like I'd pushed through everything else in my life. But malaria doesn't care about pride. By mid-afternoon, I was seeing things that weren't there. My mother's face in the clouds. Shadows that moved like living creatures. The fever climbed higher and higher until I couldn't tell what was real anymore. The old man's hand trembled slightly as he set down his coffee. I fell off Dusty near a creek, just slid right out of the saddle and hit the ground like a sack of grain. Couldn't get back up. My legs wouldn't work right. My arms felt like they belonged to someone else. I remember lying there in the dirt, staring up at the sky, thinking this was a hell of a way to die. Alone, burning up from the inside, too weak to even call for help. Jim paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of wonder that age hadn't diminished. Dusty ran off, not away from danger, but toward water. Horses have instincts about these things. They know where help might be found. And that horse, ornery as he was most days, he ran straight toward Apache territory, toward Kaya. Thomas leaned forward, coffee forgotten in his hands. She was out gathering herbs when she heard hoofbeats. Told me later she knew something was wrong immediately. A riderless horse running full speed means either the rider's dead or dying. She followed Dusty's trail back to where I'd fallen, and she found me lying there in the sun, unconscious, skin hot enough to blister. The fire crackled, punctuating the silence. Kaya stood over me for a long time. She told me this years later, when we were old enough to laugh about things that once seemed deadly serious. She stood there, with her hand on her knife, watching me burn, and she had to make a choice that went against everything her grief had taught her. Jim's expression grew somber. Her brother Nolan had been dead 6 months, killed by white men who'd crossed into Apache land looking for gold. She'd made a promise over his grave. A promise that no white man would ever cross that boundary and live to tell about it. She'd sworn it on her brother's memory, and among the Apache, such promises carry weight that can bend a person's whole life. Thomas felt his throat tighten, imagining the scene. A young woman standing over a dying man, torn between vengeance and something else, something harder to name. But then she remembered something else Nolan had said. His last words, spoken with blood in his mouth and death creeping close. He'd told her, "Sister, hate will poison you. I don't want that. Judge each man by his heart, not his skin." Jim's voice grew rough with emotion. Kaya had promised to protect her people, but she hadn't promised to kill every white man she saw. And standing there, watching me die slowly in the sun, she realized there was a difference that mattered. The old man took another sip of coffee, gathering himself. She dragged me to a cave. I don't remember this part. Don't remember her hauling my dead weight across rough ground, into a hidden space where the stone stayed cool even in the heat of day. I was gone by then, lost in fever dreams, where my mother was calling my name, and I couldn't find her. Thomas could picture it. The small Apache woman, barely 24 years old, choosing to save a man who represented everything she'd learned to hate. Kaya used medicines her grandmother had taught her. Willow bark, which the Apache had been using for centuries. White doctors back east were just starting to figure out what willow bark could do in 1876. They'd discovered it contained something that could break a fever, something they'd later call salicylic acid. But the Apache already knew, had known for generations. Jim's voice carried a note of respect that transcended time. She made a tea from yarrow, too. It's a plant that grows along creek beds, small white flowers that most people ride right past without noticing. But Apache healers knew it could reduce inflammation, help the body fight back against sickness. And she put wet tobacco leaves on my forehead, not to smoke, as a poultice. The moisture would evaporate and cool the skin, giving my brain a chance to stop cooking itself. The old man looked at his grandson, making sure the boy understood the significance. All of this, Thomas, all of this knowledge that saved my life, it came from a people that men like Morrison called savages, called primitive, called uncivilized. But they knew things about healing that most white doctors couldn't even imagine. Thomas nodded slowly, beginning to see his grandmother's people in a different light. I was out for 2 days. 2 full days where I wandered through fever dreams so vivid I still remember them. I saw my mother's face, young and healthy, like she'd been before the sickness took her. I talked to her like she was really there. Told her things I'd never said out loud to anyone.
Jim's hands tightened around his coffee cup. I apologized to her for not having enough money to save her, for being 8 years old and useless when she needed me most, for spending 20 years running from that failure instead of accepting it. I told her I was tired, so damn tired of carrying that weight, of feeling like I didn't deserve to be alive when she wasn't. A log shifted in the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. Kaya heard all of it. She was sitting there, tending to me, changing the poultice on my head, making me drink water when I was conscious enough to swallow. And she heard me confess every broken piece of my soul to a woman who'd been dead 20 years. The old man's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. That's when she stopped seeing me as a white man, started seeing me as just a man, just someone who'd lost people and never learned how to forgive himself for surviving. She understood that pain because she carried the same weight. Her mother had died when she was young. Her brother had died 6 months ago. She knew what it meant to wake up every day feeling like you should have done more, been more, saved them somehow. Thomas found himself blinking back unexpected tears. He'd never heard his grandfather speak like this, never seen this vulnerable side of the strong, silent man who'd raised him after his own father had died. On the second night, the fever finally broke. I woke up weak as a newborn calf, but my mind was clear for the first time in days. I opened my eyes and saw Kaya sitting near the cave entrance, silhouetted against the moonlight. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking out at the night, and I could see the weight on her shoulders, the burden of the choice she'd made. Jim set down his coffee, his hands needing something else to do. I asked her why she saved me. My voice came out like gravel scraping stone, but she heard me. She turned, and in the dim light, I could see her face. Young, but aged by loss. Strong, but carrying cracks that grief had carved deep. The old man closed his eyes, remembering. She said, "I don't know yet." Thomas felt the weight of those words settle over the room. I told her that was wisdom, asked who'd taught her something that profound. She smiled then, just a little. First time I'd seen anything like joy touch her face. She said, "A 16-year-old boy with more courage than most warriors." Jim opened his eyes, and they were bright with unshed tears. That's when I truly understood what she'd lost. Not just a brother, but a teacher. Someone who'd helped her see the world in ways that most people never manage. And I felt the weight of being saved by someone who was grieving so deeply. The responsibility of that gift. The wind rattled the windows again, but inside the house, everything was still except for the crackling fire and the old man's voice. We sat in that cave talking until dawn. Not about the past, about small things. The way birds announced the morning, the smell of sage after rain, the sound a creek makes when it's running over smooth stones. Normal things, human things. Things that had nothing to do with skin color or history or hate. Jim's expression softened with memory. That's when we heard the horses. Thomas's attention sharpened. Lots of horses, moving fast. Kaya went still, listening with the intensity of a hunter. Then she cursed in Apache, said soldiers were coming, cavalry from Fort Bowie,
probably searching for deserters or following up on reports of Apache activity in the area. The old man's jaw tightened. If they found me with her, we were both dead. They'd assume I'd been captured, would kill her for taking a white man prisoner, even though she'd done the opposite. Or worse, they'd assume we were together by choice, and neither of us would survive what came next. Thomas felt his pulse quicken, caught up in the tension of the moment. Kaya looked at me, and I saw her making another choice, another decision that went against her training, her instincts, everything her life had taught her. She told me to stay hidden, to trust her completely, and then she walked out of that cave to face 8 armed cavalry soldiers alone. Jim stood up slowly, his old bones protesting, and walked to the window. He stared out at the darkness, seeing something beyond the glass. The leader was a sergeant named Samuel Porter, 35 years old, mean as a snake, with eyes that had seen too much killing and not enough consequence. He was the kind of man who joined the army after the Civil War because he didn't know how to stop fighting. Didn't want to stop. The old man's voice hardened. Porter asked Kaya if she'd seen any white men, any soldiers. She stood there, this young Apache woman, barely 24 years old, facing down 8 armed men on horses, and she lied without a flicker of hesitation. Told them in broken English that she hadn't seen anyone, that she was just gathering medicine plants. Thomas could picture it. The small woman standing defiant, while men with rifles looked down at her from horseback. Porter didn't believe her at first, said Apache women don't gather herbs alone. It was a test. He was trying to catch her in a lie. But Kaya just looked at him with eyes that had seen death and wasn't impressed by it. Told him her brother was dead, her father was old, so she gathered alone now. It was the truth, and truth has a sound that's hard to fake. Jim turned from the window, his face grave. Then Kaya did something brilliant. She pointed east, toward the desert badlands, where water was scarce and the heat could kill a man in hours. Told Porter she'd seen tracks heading that way 2 days ago, 2 men on foot, moving fast. Deserters, probably. The old man's expression held grudging admiration. Porter wanted to believe her, wanted to chase those deserters and claim the credit for bringing them back. So he believed. Gave Kaya a warning before he left, though. Told her if he found out she'd lied, he'd come back and burn her village to ashes. Thomas felt anger rise in his chest at the casual cruelty of the threat. Kaya didn't flinch. Told him there was no village, only her. It was another kind of truth. Her people were scattered, hiding in small groups across the territory, trying to survive government policies designed to destroy them. There was no single village to burn. Jim sat back down, the weight of the story pressing on him. Porter and his men rode east into country that would punish them for days, and Kaya came back to the cave where I'd been lying flat, buried under leaves and dirt, barely breathing. She dug me out with her bare hands, and when I could finally suck in air, I asked her the question that had been burning in my mind. The old man leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I asked why she'd protected me, why she'd risked everything to send those soldiers away. She could have told them where I was, could have washed her hands of the whole situation. Instead, she'd put herself between me and death again. Thomas waited, holding his breath. She looked at me with those dark eyes that had seen too much loss, and she said something I've never forgotten. She said, "Because you are not their soldier, and I don't help men who hang other men for wanting freedom." Jim's voice grew quieter. That's when I learned the Apache had seen deserters before, men who'd run from the army because they couldn't stomach the orders anymore, couldn't keep following commanders who treated human beings like vermin to be exterminated. The Apache called them Men who chose life over chains. And Kaya respected that choice. Respected the courage it took to walk away from power when your conscience demanded it. The fire burned low, but neither man moved to tend it. After Porter left, Kaya helped me wash the dirt and leaves off my face. We walked down to a creek, and she knelt beside me, using water to clean the grime away. It was the first time she'd touched me gently, not as a healer working on a patient, just as one person helping another. Jim's voice took on a tenderness that transformed it. I looked at her while she worked, really looked at her for the first time since we'd met. Saw the way moonlight caught in her black hair, the careful way her hands moved, the small scar on her chin that I'd later learned came from a childhood fall, and I felt something shift in my chest. Something that had nothing to do with fever and everything to do with recognition. Thomas saw his grandfather's face soften with a memory that still held power after more than 4 decades. I told her I owed her my life twice now, once from the fever, once from the soldiers. She avoided my eyes, focusing on washing dirt from my neck. Said if I owed her, then I should stay alive. Dead men can't repay debts. The old man smiled slightly. It was her way of saying she wanted me alive, wanted me to matter. And I understood then that something had changed between us. We weren't strangers anymore, weren't even just allies. We'd become something else, something neither of us had words for yet. Jim stood again, this time moving to the mantel where an old photograph sat in a simple frame. He picked it up gently, showing it to Thomas. A young woman with fierce eyes and a slight smile, standing next to a tall cowboy with his arm around her waist. 3 days after the soldiers left, we hunted together for the first time. Not because we'd planned it, just because it happened naturally. I was tracking a deer, and she was tracking the same deer from another direction. We saw each other across a clearing, and without saying a word, we both understood what needed to happen. The old man's eyes grew bright with the memory. I had my Winchester. She knew I'd practiced with that rifle until I could hit a target at 200 yards in wind. Kaya had her bow, recurve style, made from mountain mahogany and sinew. Silent as a thought, but only effective within 50 yards. Thomas listened, fascinated by the technical details his grandfather remembered so clearly. She was faster, better at moving through brush without sound. So she drove the deer toward me, and I took the shot from distance. Clean kill. The deer died quickly, without suffering. That mattered to both of us.
Jim set the photograph back on the mantel with careful reverence. Then Kaya taught me something I've never forgotten. She showed me how to thank the deer's spirit for giving its life to feed us. It's an Apache tradition. You place tobacco on the deer's tongue, speak words of gratitude, acknowledge the sacrifice. Most white men would have called it superstition, but I saw it differently. Saw it as respect, recognition that we'd taken a life to sustain our own, and that debt deserved acknowledgement. The old man returned to his chair. I performed the ritual slowly, carefully, trying to do it right. Not because I believed the deer's spirit was watching, but because Kaya believed it mattered, and that was enough for me. When I finished, she nodded once, just once, but that single nod carried more approval than 100 words. Thomas realized he'd been sitting motionless for so long, his legs had gone numb. We butchered the deer together, working in comfortable silence. She showed me which cuts were best for drying, which needed to be eaten fresh. I showed her a technique for preserving meat using salt and smoke that cowboys had learned from Mexican vaqueros. We traded knowledge like traders trading goods,
each offering something the other didn't have. Jim's voice grew warmer. That evening, sitting by a fire with venison roasting on sticks, she asked me a question that I knew mattered. She asked why I'd come to Arizona in the first place, what I was looking for in a territory that most people saw as nothing but dust and danger. The old man paused, remembering the weight of that question. I told her the truth, said I had no family left, no land to call my own, no place that felt like home. I'd been drifting since my mother died, working ranches from Texas to New Mexico, saving money, but never finding anywhere that felt right. I was looking for a place to belong, I told her, somewhere that felt like it was mine, even if I didn't own the deed.
Jim looked at his grandson with eyes that had seen the full arc of a life. She was quiet for a long time after I said that, just stared into the fire, thinking. Then she said something that's stuck with me every day since. She said, "Maybe home is not a place. Maybe it is people." Thomas felt those words settle into his chest, finding purchase there. We looked at each other across that fire, and something passed between us that didn't need words, an understanding, a possibility. The beginning of something that neither of us had been looking for, but both of us recognized when it appeared. The old man's expression grew serious again. That's when we heard the gunshots. Thomas jerked upright, pulled abruptly from the warm intimacy of the moment into sudden danger. Multiple guns, coming from the direction of Kaya's village. She went absolutely still, listening with every fiber of her being. Then she cursed in Apache. A word I didn't know, but understood from her tone, meant something terrible had happened. Jim's hands clenched into fists. She said it wasn't soldiers. Soldiers moved in formation, fired in volleys, made noise like an organized force. This was chaotic, random, the sound of outlaws or raiders who'd found an undefended target and were taking what they wanted. The old man's voice dropped lower. Kaya looked at me, and I saw fear in her eyes for the first time. Real fear, not for herself, for her people, for her father, who was too old to fight, for the children and women who couldn't defend themselves against armed men. Thomas leaned forward, his earlier thoughts of leaving completely forgotten. I asked her if the soldiers had come back. She shook her head, said this was worse, said when cavalry came, at least they followed rules, however brutal those rules might be. But outlaws? They followed nothing but greed and cruelty. They took what they wanted and left only bodies behind. Jim stood once more, moving to the window, his reflection ghostly in the dark glass. I made a choice then, Thomas, a choice that would determine everything that came after. I could have stayed back, let Kaya handle her people's problems, kept myself safe and uninvolved. After all, I was just a cowboy who'd stumbled into the wrong territory. Their fight wasn't mine. The old man turned, and his eyes blazed with the same fire they must have held 44 years ago. But I looked at this woman who'd saved my life twice, who'd risked everything to protect me from soldiers who would have killed her without hesitation, and I knew staying back wasn't an option. Not if I wanted to look at myself in a mirror ever again. Jim's voice grew stronger. I told her I was coming with her, that she'd saved my life, and it was time I started using that life for something that mattered. She tried to argue. Maze, it wasn't my fight, wasn't my people. But I cut her off. The old man's jaw set with remembered determination. I told her that when someone saves your life, you don't get to choose which of their battles you help fight. You help with all of them. That's what the debt means. That's what honor demands. Thomas saw his grandfather not as an old man anymore, but as the young cowboy who'd made a choice that would echo through generations.
Kaya looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded, just once. But in that nod, I saw acceptance, partnership, the beginning of trust that went deeper than gratitude. She was letting me stand beside her, not behind her or in front of her, beside her, as an equal. Jim's voice filled with quiet intensity. We ran toward the sound of gunfire, toward danger that could kill us both, toward a battle that wasn't mine by birth, but had become mine by choice. And as we ran through the darkness together, I knew my life had just changed, in ways I couldn't even begin to understand. The old man sat back down, suddenly looking tired. But that's a story for tomorrow night, boy. Because what happened next, what we found when we reached her village, that's when I learned what it really means to fight for something, what it costs, and what you gain that no amount of money could ever buy. Thomas opened his mouth to protest, to beg for more story, but something in his grandfather's face stopped him. "Get some sleep," Jim said quietly. "Morning comes early, and if you're still planning to leave, you'll need your rest. But if you want to hear how your grandmother and I fought off 6 armed outlaws, saved her people, and earned a marriage that lasted 42 years, well, that story will keep until tomorrow." The fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in deep shadow. Thomas stood slowly, his packed bag in the corner, looking smaller somehow, less important. "Good night, Grandpa." "Good night, boy." Thomas paused at the door to his room, looking back at the old man silhouetted against the dying fire. "Thank you for telling me." Jim nodded slowly. "Some stories need telling. Some lessons only come through hearing what came before. Sleep well, Thomas. Tomorrow, you'll hear about the day I killed 3 men and learned what it means to protect the people you love." The door closed softly, and Jim sat alone in the darkness, remembering a night 44 years ago when he'd run toward gunfire with an Apache woman at his side, not knowing if he'd survive, but knowing he'd made the only choice his heart would allow. Outside, the wind died down. Inside, memories burned brighter than any fire. Morning came cold and bright. Thomas found his grandfather already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and the worn leather journal he sometimes wrote in. The old man looked up when Thomas entered, and something passed between them. An understanding that the story wasn't finished, that some truths demand their full telling. "You make your decision yet?" Jim asked, his voice carrying none of yesterday's weariness. Thomas poured himself coffee, sat down across from his grandfather. "I want to hear the rest first." Jim nodded slowly, as if this was the answer he'd expected. He closed his journal, set it aside, and looked out the window where dawn was painting the Arizona sky in shades of gold and crimson. The gunfire came from a canyon about 2 miles from where Kaya and I had been sitting. We ran most of that distance, her leading because she knew the land like some men know their own hands. I followed, trying to keep pace, my Winchester heavy in my grip, and my heart hammering against my ribs. The old man's hands wrapped around his coffee cup, steadying themselves. We came up on a ridge overlooking her village, just as the sun started climbing. What I saw made my blood turn cold. Thomas leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. There were 6 men on horses surrounding a group of maybe 30 people, mostly women, children, and elders. The men who could fight were out hunting or had already been killed. I don't know which. What I do know is that the people in that village were defenseless, and the men surrounding them knew it. Jim's voice hardened with remembered anger. The leader was Samuel Porter, the same sergeant who'd been looking for deserters 3 days earlier. Except he wasn't wearing an army uniform anymore. He'd stripped it off, revealing the truth underneath. He'd never been a real soldier, just an outlaw wearing stolen blues, using army authority to scout for targets. The old man's jaw tightened.
Porter had his gun pointed at an old man tied to a post in the center of the village. I'd learn later this was Taze, the eldest of the council. 72 years old, hands bound, blood running from a cut above his eye. Porter was shouting at him, demanding to know where the Apache gold was hidden. Thomas felt anger rising in his own chest, generations removed from the moment, but feeling its injustice just the same. Taze kept saying there was no gold, only graves, sacred graves where the ancestors rested. But Porter wasn't listening. Men like him never do. They see what they want to see, believe what serves their greed, and damn anyone who tells them different. Jim took a long drink of coffee, steeling himself for what came next. Kaya was shaking beside me, not from fear, from rage, pure crystallized fury at seeing her people held hostage, her elder bleeding, her sacred places threatened. She started to stand, ready to charge down there alone, but I grabbed her arm. The old man's expression shifted, remembering the weight of that moment. I told her we needed a plan. 6 guns against 2 meant we'd die if we just rushed in shooting. We needed to be smart, use the land, divide their attention. She wanted to argue. I could see it in her eyes. But she also knew I was right. So we crouched there on that ridge and planned how 2 people might save 30. Thomas could picture it. The young cowboy and the Apache warrior, heads together, plotting against impossible odds. The village sat in a narrow canyon with steep walls on 3 sides and only one way in or out. Porter had positioned his men to control that entrance. Smart tactically, but it also meant they were all focused in one direction. Kaya knew a way down the back wall, a path that goats used, too narrow for horses but manageable for people on foot. Jim's eyes grew distant with memory. She suggested we split up. She'd go down into the village using that goat path, create a distraction, maybe free Taze. I'd stay high with my rifle, pick off anyone who tried to hurt the villagers. It was a terrible plan. Lots of ways for both of us to die. But it was the only plan we had. The old man paused, his voice dropping lower. Before she left, she looked at me. Really looked at me. And she said something in Apache. I didn't understand the words then, but years later she told me what they meant. She'd said, "If I die today, know that you made me remember what my brother taught me. That courage and kindness can live in the same heart." Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion he didn't fully understand. Then she was gone, moving down that cliff face like water flowing over stone. Silent and sure and absolutely fearless. I watched her go, knowing I might never see her alive again, and I understood something that I'd been trying not to name. I loved her. Had probably loved her since the moment she'd chosen to save my life, instead of end it. Jim's hands trembled slightly as he set down his coffee. I found a position behind rocks about 200 yards from the village. Long range for the Winchester, but not impossible. I could see Porter clearly, see him waving his pistol around, while he ranted about gold and treasure and getting rich. The other 5 men were spread out, keeping the villagers in one tight group, rifles ready but pointed down. They weren't expecting trouble, thought they had the situation under control. The old man's voice grew colder, harder. That's when Kaya made her move. She'd circled around through the goat path and come up behind where Taze was tied. None of Porter's men saw her. They were watching the villagers, not looking behind them. She cut the old man's ropes with her obsidian knife, quick and clean, and Taze stumbled forward into the crowd of his people. Thomas could see it playing out like a scene from one of those moving pictures, but realer, more immediate. Porter spun around, finally realizing something was wrong. He saw Kaya standing there, knife in hand, and his face went red with rage. He called her a word I won't repeat, raised his pistol, aimed it right at her chest. Jim's voice went quiet. I pulled the trigger. The room seemed to hold its breath. The Winchester kicked against my shoulder. The sound echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. And Porter's hat flew off his head, my bullet passing so close to his skull it must have felt like death brushing past. I'd aimed for his head, but at 200 yards with a moving target, I was lucky to come that close. The old man looked at his hands, as if seeing them from long ago, younger and steadier. Porter dove for cover, screaming orders. His men scattered, trying to figure out where the shot came from. That's when the villagers moved. Women grabbed children and ran for the narrow spaces between wickiups where horses couldn't follow. Old men, who'd been pretending weakness, suddenly had knives in their hands, cutting at the legs of horses, creating chaos. Jim's voice picked up pace, matching the remembered urgency. I fired again, aiming for one of the outlaws trying to ride down a woman carrying 2 children. Hit his horse instead. The animal screamed and went down, throwing its rider hard into the dirt. The man didn't get back up. I don't know if the fall killed him or if he was just stunned, but he was out of the fight. Thomas realized he'd been holding his breath. He let it out slowly. Kaya was moving through the chaos like a ghost, her knife finding targets. She hamstrung a horse, cut the cinch on a saddle so the rider fell, kicked another man in the knee hard enough that I heard the crack from 200 yards away. She wasn't trying to kill. She was trying to disable, to create enough confusion that her people could escape. The old man's expression filled with admiration that time hadn't diminished. But Porter was smart, vicious and greedy, but smart. He realized the rifle fire was coming from the ridge, realized Kaya was the one creating havoc down below. He shouted to his men, told 3 of them to go after the villagers, while he and 2 others went hunting for Kaya. Jim stood up, too agitated by the memory to sit still. I saw him corner her near the edge of the village. She had her knife, he had his pistol. No contest in terms of reach or killing power. He was going to shoot her, and I was too far away to stop it in time. The old man walked to the window, his reflection overlaying the morning landscape. So I did something crazy. I stood up from my covered position, making myself a target, and I started running down that ridge toward the village. Running and shooting at the same time, which meant I wasn't hitting anything, but I was making a hell of a lot of noise. Porter heard me coming, turned to face this new threat, and that half-second of distraction was all Kaya needed. Thomas stood too, drawn by the intensity of the story. She threw her knife, not at Porter, but at his gun hand. The obsidian blade buried itself in his wrist, and he dropped his pistol with a scream. Then Kaya was on him, moving faster than thought, slamming her elbow into his throat and dropping him to his knees. Jim turned from the window, his eyes bright with the memory. I reached the village just as Porter's remaining men realized they were losing. One of them, young kid, maybe 19 years old, raised his rifle at me from 20 feet away. I had a choice to make in the space of a heartbeat, him or me. I chose me. The old man's voice went flat, emotionless in the way people sound when they're talking about things that still hurt. I shot him in the chest, center mass, like I'd been taught. He went down hard and didn't move. That was the first man I ever killed. I was 28 years old, and I took a life to save my own. Thomas saw the weight his grandfather still carried 44 years later. The other 2 outlaws broke and ran, got on their horses and rode like hell itself was chasing them.
Maybe it was. I'd like to think it was. I put 2 more shots after them, missing both times, but making sure they kept running and didn't look back. Jim sat back down heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 72 years. Porter was still on his knees, clutching his wrist where Kaya's knife had gone through. Blood was running between his fingers, and his face had gone white with shock and pain. Kaya stood over him with her knife back in her hand, and I could see her deciding, trying to choose between justice and mercy. The old man's voice softened. I walked over to them, my rifle still raised, and I watched her struggle with that decision. She could have killed him, would have been justified. He'd threatened her people, shed blood in a sacred place, stolen and murdered his way across the territory. The world wouldn't miss him. Thomas waited, knowing this moment mattered in ways he was only beginning to understand. But she lowered her knife, looked at Porter with contempt instead of hate. And she said something I've never forgotten. She said, "Death is too easy for you. You will leave here knowing you failed. You will live with that shame. That is worse than any grave." Jim's expression filled with pride. Then she turned to me and saw what was in my face. The shock of having killed someone, the sick feeling that comes after. She put her hand on my shoulder and she said, "You protected life. That is not murder. That is survival." The old man's voice cracked slightly. But it didn't feel like survival. It felt like I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. Like some part of me had died, along with that 19-year-old kid who'd probably just been following Porter for money and adventure and had no idea what evil really looked like. Thomas moved closer to his grandfather, not sure what to say, but needing to be near. We tied Porter up and left him for the cavalry to find. Figured actual soldiers would have questions about a man pretending to be one of them. And we helped the villagers tend to their wounded. Taze had a deep cut above his eye and rope burns on his wrists, but he was alive. Everyone was alive. We'd somehow managed to fight off 6 armed men without losing a single person. Jim looked at his grandson with eyes that had seen both the best and worst of what humans could do. That evening, after everything was done, after Porter had been dragged away and the dead outlaw had been buried, Taze called a council. All the elders gathered around a fire, and they asked me to sit with them. An outsider, a white man, sitting in council with Apache elders. The old man's voice filled with wonder. Taze spoke first. He said I'd fought for people who weren't my blood, protected a place that wasn't my home, risked my life for those who'd given me no reason to care. He said that was the mark of a true warrior, not the killing, but the choosing, the decision to stand between harm and those too weak to defend themselves. Thomas felt pride swelling in his chest for a grandfather he was only now truly beginning to know. Then Taze asked me a question. He asked if I planned to leave now that the danger had passed, go back to my own people, my own life. I could see Kaya watching me from across the fire, her face carefully neutral, but her eyes holding something I couldn't quite name. Jim paused, letting the weight of that moment settle over the room. I told them the truth. Maze, I had no people to go back to, no life worth returning to. That I'd spent 20 years looking for a place where I belonged, and I'd finally found it. Not in the land itself, but in the people who protected it. In a woman who'd taught me that courage and mercy weren't opposites. They were partners. The old man smiled slightly. Taze looked at Kaya then, and he asked her a question in Apache. She answered quietly, but firmly. He nodded slowly, then turned back to me. He said that if Kaya chose me, and if I chose her, then the council would respect that choice. But I needed to understand what it meant. Thomas leaned forward, sensing they were approaching the heart of the story. Taze said, I wasn't just marrying a woman, I was marrying a people. Their pain became my pain. Their enemies became my enemies. Their sacred places became my responsibility to protect. Could I carry that weight? Could I commit to something bigger than myself, knowing it might cost me everything? Jim's voice grew stronger. I looked at Kaya across that fire, saw her watching me with those fierce eyes that had seen me at my weakest and hadn't turned away. Saw the hope she was trying to hide, the vulnerability underneath all that warrior strength. And I knew my answer. The old man stood once more, walking to the mantel where the photograph of his young self and Kaya stood in its simple frame. I told Taze I'd been carrying loneliness for 20 years. I'd rather carry love and responsibility. Rather wake up every morning with a purpose bigger than my own survival. Rather protect something that mattered than spend another day drifting through a life that felt empty. Jim touched the photograph gently, his fingers tracing the outline of Kaya's face. The council gave me 3 tests. 3 days to prove I could live up to the commitment I'd just made. First test was survival. They sent me into the wilderness with nothing but a knife and told me to come back in 3 days with food. I came back with 2 rabbits and a bundle of yarrow for a child who'd been coughing. Passed. The old man's voice carried quiet pride. Second test was language. They told me to learn 50 words in Apache, basic words, greetings, directions, family terms. I learned 73. Stayed up all night memorizing them, practicing pronunciation until my tongue felt like leather. Passed. Jim turned back to his grandson. Third test was the hardest. They asked me if I'd leave if Kaya said no. If she chose not to marry me, would I respect that choice and ride away forever? Never come back, never try to change her mind. Could I love her enough to let her go? Thomas felt the weight of that question across the decades. I said yes, meant it too. Told them if Kaya told me to leave, I'd go. Because real love means respecting someone's choice, even when it breaks your heart. Especially when it breaks your heart. The old man's eyes grew bright with memory. Kaya had been sitting silent through all 3 tests, her face unreadable. But when I said that, when I promised to leave if she asked, I saw something change in her expression. Saw the walls come down just a little. Saw her decide to take a risk that probably scared her as much as facing Porter's gun had. Jim's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She stood up in front of the whole council, walked over to me, and took my hand. First time she'd touched me in front of her people. First public acknowledgement that I was more than just an ally, that I was something else. Something that didn't have a name in either of our languages, but existed all the same. The old man looked at Thomas with eyes that had seen a lifetime of love. She said she chose me, not because she had to, because she wanted to. Said I'd proven that people could change, could grow beyond the circumstances of their birth, that her brother had been right about judging hearts instead of skin, and that if I was willing to commit to her people, she was willing to commit to building a life together. Thomas felt tears prickling at his eyes, moved by a love story that had shaped his entire existence, without him fully understanding it until now. The council approved. Taze gave his blessing, and 2 days later, under an old cottonwood tree that had been standing there since before white men came to Arizona, Kaya and I were married in a ceremony that had nothing to do with churches or papers or legal recognition. We made promises to each other in 2 languages, exchanged gifts that mattered more than gold, and started a life that would span 42 years and produce 3 children, 12 grandchildren, and 42 great-grandchildren. We lived with her people those first 3 years, building our home at the edge of the village. I worked odd jobs, hunted bounties, saved every dollar. And in 1879, when the reward for capturing Porter came through, I finally had enough to buy land of our own. 160 acres, enough to build something that would last. Jim's voice filled with quiet satisfaction. This land we're standing on? I bought it 3 years later, with money I'd earned hunting down outlaws like Porter. $500 reward, enough to buy 160 acres and build a life that mattered. Kaya and I raised our family here, taught our children to respect both their Apache heritage and their father's stubbornness, built something that lasted. The old man turned to face his grandson fully. Your grandmother died 2 years ago. Spanish flu took her, same disease that killed millions worldwide. She was 66 years old, and she fought that sickness like she'd fought everything else in her life, with courage and dignity and absolute refusal to surrender until her body gave her no choice. Thomas saw the grief still raw in his grandfather's eyes. I buried her next to Nolan and Taze, in the place she'd spent her young life protecting. And I planted a tree over her grave, cottonwood, like the one we were married under. Every morning I walk out there and tell her about my day, about you, about the life we built together, still continuing, even though she's gone. Jim's voice grew stronger. So when you ask me why you should stay on this land instead of running off to the city, that's my answer, Thomas. This isn't just dirt and grass. It's memory. It's sacrifice. It's proof that love can cross any divide if people are brave enough to build the bridge. The old man placed his hand on his grandson's shoulder. I'm not saying don't go. I left too, remember? Spent years drifting before I found my home. What I'm saying is, when you find that place, that person, that purpose that makes you want to fight 6 armed men just to protect it, don't let fear or doubt or other people's opinions stop you from committing fully. Thomas felt something shift inside him. Not a decision exactly, more like an understanding, a foundation being laid for choices he'd make in his own time. Now, Jim said, his voice lighter, how about we go tend to those fences you think are so boring? And while we work, I'll tell you about the time your grandmother outshot 3 cavalry officers in a shooting competition and won a horse that I still say she didn't need. Thomas smiled through the moisture in his eyes. His packed bag sat forgotten in his room. The city would still be there tomorrow, next week, next month. But this moment, this connection to a past that had shaped his present, this would only happen if he chose to stay and learn it. I'd like that, Grandpa. Good boy. Jim squeezed his grandson's shoulder once, then released him. Good boy. They walked out together into the bright Arizona morning, where the land stretched endlessly in all directions, holding stories in every stone and tree and blade of grass. Stories of courage and love and choices that echoed through generations. Stories that would keep being told as long as someone remained to listen. And for now, Thomas was listening. 3 days passed. Thomas stayed. He told himself it was just for a few more days, just to hear more stories, just to help his grandfather with the fences that needed mending and the cattle that needed checking. But deep down, in a place he wasn't quite ready to examine, he knew something had changed. The city's pull had weakened, replaced by something harder to name but easier to feel. On the fourth morning, Thomas found his grandfather standing by the fence line that marked the eastern boundary of their property.
The old man was looking out toward the mountains, his weathered hat pulled low against the rising sun. "You're up early," Thomas said, coming to stand beside him. "Old men don't sleep much. Too many memories demanding attention." Jim didn't look at his grandson, just kept his eyes on the distant peaks. "Besides, I wanted to show you something before the day gets too hot." They walked together across land that Thomas had known his whole life, but never really understood. Jim pointed out things he'd never noticed before. A particular rock formation where Kaya had once waited out a dust storm. A depression in the earth where they'd built their first wickiup before the main house was constructed. A twisted juniper tree that had been young when they'd arrived and was now ancient, bearing witness to decades of life lived in its shadow. "Your grandmother taught me to see this land differently," Jim said as they walked. "Most white settlers looked at Arizona and saw wasteland, something to be conquered or endured. But Kaya taught me to see the life hiding in plain sight. The medicinal plants growing in creek beds, the animal trails that told stories about water sources, the way certain rocks held heat that could warm you through a cold night." Thomas listened, storing away details he'd never thought to ask about. They reached a small grove of cottonwood trees, and Jim stopped. In the center of the grove were 3 headstones. Simple markers, nothing elaborate, but well maintained. Fresh wildflowers lay on each one. "Nolan," Jim said, pointing to the smallest stone. "I never met him, but I visited his grave 1,000 times because Kaya needed me to. Needed someone to remember him with her. Needed the burden of memory shared." He moved to the next stone. Taze lived to be 87 years old, outlived most of his generation. He once told me that the key to long life wasn't avoiding hardship, but finding reasons to endure it. He said meeting me gave him hope that maybe the world could change, even if it took longer than one lifetime. Thomas felt a lump forming in his throat. The third stone bore a name he knew well: Kaya Thornton. The dates carved beneath showed a life that had spanned 66 years. Not long enough. Never long enough. "I come here every morning," Jim said quietly. "Tell her about you. About how you're growing into a man. About the choices you're facing. Sometimes I think I hear her laughing at me for talking to a stone. But other times, I swear I can feel her listening." The old man knelt slowly, his joints protesting, and touched the headstone with gentle reverence. "She made me promise something before she died. Made me swear on everything we'd built together. You want to know what it was?" Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. "She made me promise to tell our story, to make sure our grandchildren and great-grandchildren knew what we'd fought for, what we'd built." She said too many stories get lost because people think they're too small to matter. But she believed our story mattered. Not because we were special, but because we proved something important. Jim stood slowly, turning to face his grandson. "We proved that love is stronger than hate, that choice matters more than circumstance, that 2 people from completely different worlds can build something beautiful if they're willing to do the hard work of understanding each other." The morning sun climbed higher, painting the cottonwoods in shades of gold. "Your grandmother also made me promise something else," Jim continued. "She made me promise not to hold you here if you wanted to go. Said every generation needs to find their own path, make their own mistakes, discover their own truth.
She didn't want you staying out of obligation or guilt. She wanted you staying because you'd chosen it, the way I'd chosen her.
Thomas felt the weight of those words, the freedom and responsibility they carried in equal measure. So here's what I'm telling you, boy. That city you want to see? Go see it. Spend a year there if you need to. Work those jobs you think are so much better than ranching. Live that life you're imagining. But while you're gone, I want you to carry something with you. Jim reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in worn leather. He unfolded the leather carefully, revealing a bracelet woven from black hair and sinew. Simple, but beautiful in its simplicity. Kaya made this from her own hair and her brother Nolan's. She gave it to me the night we were married. Told me it was a reminder that we carry our dead with us, that they shape who we become even after they're gone. I've worn it every day for 44 years. The old man held it out to Thomas. I want you to have it now, not to keep you here, but to remind you where you come from. To help you remember that home isn't just a place you leave. It's a foundation you build on, no matter how far you travel. Thomas took the bracelet with trembling hands. The hair was still black, preserved by careful handling and the dry Arizona climate. He could feel the weight of history in it, the connection to people he'd never met but who'd shaped his entire existence. Grandpa, I can't take this. It's yours. It's all you have left of her. Jim shook his head firmly. I have 44 years of memories. I have this land we built together. I have children and grandchildren who carry her blood and her spirit. A bracelet is just hair and thread. But what it represents, that lives on in you, whether you wear it or not. The old man placed his weathered hand over Thomas's younger one, the bracelet between them. Your grandmother used to say that the Apache measure wealth differently than white men. We count money and acres. They count stories and connections. They count the number of people who will remember you after you're gone, and the lessons you left behind. Jim's voice grew softer, more intimate. By that measure, Thomas, your grandmother was the richest person I ever knew. She touched hundreds of lives, taught dozens of children how to read, both Apache and white kids, in a time when most people thought education should be segregated. She healed people who couldn't afford doctors. She built bridges between communities that had every reason to hate each other. Thomas slipped the bracelet onto his wrist. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for him. The night before she died, when the fever was high and she was struggling to breathe, she called me to her bedside. She could barely whisper, but she made sure I heard every word. The old man's eyes grew distant with memory. She said, "Tell them I was happy. Tell them I chose well. Tell them love is worth every sacrifice it demands." Those were her last coherent words. After that, she slipped into unconsciousness and never woke up. A meadowlark sang somewhere in the cottonwoods, its song bright against the weight of the moment. I've kept that promise, Jim continued. I've told everyone who'd listen that Kaya Thornton lived a life of purpose and died with no regrets. But there's one more part of her message I haven't shared yet. One more piece she wanted passed on to you specifically. Thomas looked up sharply. To me? To you. She knew she might not live to see you grow into a man, so she left words for you, made me memorize them so I'd get them exactly right when the time came. Jem took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the cadence of someone reciting something sacred. She said, "Tell my grandson Thomas that the world will try to tell him who he should be. It will offer him easy paths and safe choices, but the most important thing he can do is listen to the voice inside that knows what matters." That voice is me, and his grandfather, and Nolan,
and Taizé, and everyone who came before. We're all there, whispering wisdom. He just has to be still enough to hear it. Thomas felt tears streaming down his face, not bothering to wipe them away. She also said, "Tell him it's okay to leave. It's okay to search. But when he finds something worth protecting, when he finds people worth fighting for, I hope he has the courage to stay, the courage to commit, the courage to build instead of always searching for something better." Jim's own eyes were wet now, decades of controlled grief finally finding release. "Your grandmother saw something in you, Thomas. Even when you were just a baby, she'd hold you and tell me you had your great-uncle Nolan's eyes. Curious eyes, brave eyes, eyes that looked at the world and wanted to understand it, not conquer it." The old man put both hands on his grandson's shoulders. "So here's what I'm offering you. Not an obligation, an opportunity. Stay one more year. Learn everything I can teach you about this land, this family, this history. Let me show you how to read the sky for weather, track animals through brush, find water where others see only dust. Let me teach you the things Kaya taught me." Jim's grip tightened slightly. "And at the end of that year, if you still want to leave, I'll drive you to the city myself. I'll give you money to get started. I'll support whatever choice you make, because I'll know you made it from a place of knowledge instead of restlessness. You'll leave because you chose to, not because you ran away from something you never understood." Thomas stood silent, feeling the weight of the bracelet on his wrist, the weight of his grandfather's hands on his shoulders, the weight of history and expectation and love, all pressing down simultaneously. "But if you stay," Jim continued, "if you choose this land and this life, then I'll teach you something even more important. I'll teach you how to be the kind of man who builds instead of takes, who protects instead of exploits, who sees people like Kaya as equals instead of curiosities, the kind of man this world desperately needs more of." The meadowlark sang again, joined now by others, their chorus filling the morning air. Thomas looked at the 3 headstones, at the cottonwoods his grandfather had planted, at the land stretching away in all directions, holding stories in every rock and tree. He thought about the city waiting somewhere beyond the horizon, full of jobs and excitement and the life he'd been imagining. But he also thought about his grandfather's words, about Kaya's message, about the bracelet on his wrist, connecting him to people who'd lived and died for something bigger than themselves. "1 year," he said finally, his voice steady despite the emotion churning inside him. "Teach me everything. Show me why this matters. And then I'll make my choice." Jim smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something younger, lighter. "That's all I ask, boy. 1 year of really seeing what's here instead of imagining what's out there. 1 year of learning instead of running. And whatever you decide after that, I'll support you completely." They stood together in the grove of cottonwoods, 3 generations of Thorntons connected by blood and choice, and the stories that made both meaningful. The sun climbed higher, warming the earth, bringing life to things that had seemed dormant. "Now," Jim said, his tone shifting back to practical matters, "we've got a full day ahead of us. Those fences won't mend themselves, and there's a calf I want you to check on. Born 3 days ago, bit weak in the legs, needs monitoring." They walked back toward the ranch house, the old man's stride sure despite his age, the young man's steps matching his, learning the rhythm of this life, 1 footfall at a time. "Grandpa," Thomas said as they walked, "will you tell me more About what happened after you married grandmother? About building this place?" "Every day," Jim promised. "Every single day for the next year. I'll tell you something new. There's 44 years of stories to share, boy. Enough to fill every evening and then some. Stories about good times and hard times. About children being born and friends dying. About droughts that nearly broke us and rains that saved us." He paused, looking back at the grove one more time. "Stories about a woman who taught me that strength comes in many forms, that warriors can be healers, that the fiercest protectors are often the gentlest souls, that love, real love, requires courage most people never have to summon." Thomas touched the bracelet on his wrist, feeling the smoothness of the woven hair, the connection it represented. "I want to hear them all." "Then you will," Jim said simply. "Every last one. And maybe, by the time I'm done, you'll understand why your grandmother and I fought so hard to build something that would outlast us. Why we believed this land and this family were worth every sacrifice." They reached the barn, and Jim pulled open the door. Inside, the smell of hay and horses and leather filled the air, familiar and comforting. The sounds of animals moving, settling, living their quiet lives. "One more thing," Jim said, pausing in the doorway. "Your grandmother used to say that we don't own this land. We're just borrowing it from our grandchildren. Everything we do, every choice we make, it's for the people who come after. That's the real legacy, not the acres or the house or the money, but the example we set, the values we pass on, the stories we tell." Thomas nodded, understanding flickering at the edges of his consciousness, like dawn light touching the horizon. "So let's get to work," Jim said, a hint of the young cowboy he'd once been showing through. "Time's wasting, and there's too much to do to spend all morning standing around talking." But as they worked through that day and the days that followed, Thomas noticed his grandfather found plenty of time for talking, for teaching, for sharing the wisdom accumulated over 7 decades of living deliberately and loving deeply. And slowly, story by story, lesson by lesson, Thomas began to understand why some people leave and some people stay, and some people, the lucky ones, find a way to do both, to carry home with them wherever they go, and to build new homes wherever they land. The bracelet stayed on his wrist, a reminder, a connection, a promise that the past shapes the future, but doesn't have to bind it. Outside, the Arizona sun blazed down on land that had seen generations rise and fall, each leaving their mark, each adding to the story still being written. And in a grove of cottonwood trees, 3 simple headstones stood watch over it all, silent guardians of memories that refused to die as long as someone remained to remember them, as long as someone stayed to carry them forward, as long as love proved stronger than time. The year unfolded like a book whose pages had been waiting to be read. Thomas learned to wake before dawn when the desert air was cool and the animals were most active. He learned to read tracks in the dust, distinguishing between coyote and fox, between a cow moving leisurely and one running from danger. His grandfather taught him with the same patience Kaya had once shown a young cowboy who thought he knew everything, but understood nothing. "Tracking isn't about following footprints," Jim explained one morning as they knelt beside marks in the sandy soil. "It's about understanding the story the land is telling you. See here, how the dirt is pushed forward? That means the animal was moving fast. And here, where the track is deeper on one side,
That tells you it was favoring a leg. Maybe injured. Maybe just tired. Thomas studied the marks with new eyes, seeing patterns he'd walked past his entire life without noticing. "Your grandmother could track anything," Jim continued, his voice carrying that particular softness it always held when speaking of Kaya. "She once followed a wounded deer for 3 miles through terrain that would have lost most hunters in the first 100 yards. Not because she wanted the meat, though we needed it, but because she said leaving an animal to suffer was disrespectful to its spirit." The old man stood slowly, his knees protesting less than they had a month ago, as if the act of teaching had given him renewed strength. "She tracked it, found it lying in a thicket, and ended its pain with one clean shot from my Winchester. Then she performed the ceremony, thanking its spirit, and we butchered it right there."
Carried the meat home and fed 15 people for a week. That was her way. Practical but respectful. Efficient but honorable. As the weeks passed, Thomas began to understand that every lesson his grandfather taught contained layers he was only beginning to perceive. When Jim showed him how to mend fence wire, he was also teaching him about patience and attention to detail. When they repaired the barn roof, the old man was demonstrating how small maintenance prevents catastrophic failure. "Life's like a fence line," Jim said one afternoon as they stretched new wire. "You can ignore the weak spots, tell yourself they'll hold a little longer, and maybe they will. But eventually, neglect catches up. The wire breaks, the cattle get out, and fixing it becomes 10 times harder than if you just dealt with it when you first noticed the problem." Thomas twisted the wire, forming the connection his grandfather had shown him. "Kaya taught me that lesson the hard way. First year we were married, I let a section of fence go too long. Told myself I'd fix it next week, then the week after. Then one night a storm came through, and 20 head of cattle wandered off through that weak section. Took us 3 days to round them all up. 3 days of hard riding in brutal heat." Jim tested the connection Thomas had made, nodded approval. "When we finally got the last one back, Kaya didn't say a word, just looked at me with those eyes that could cut deeper than any criticism. That night she cooked supper, and after we ate she said, 'A warrior who ignores small problems creates big battles.' Never forgot that. Never let a fence go unmended again." The old man moved to the next post, and Thomas followed, their movements synchronized now in a way they hadn't been at the beginning. "That's what I'm trying to teach you, Thomas. Not just ranching skills, life skills. How to see problems before they become catastrophes. How to do things right the first time instead of having to redo them. How to take pride in work that nobody might notice, but that matters all the same." By the 4th month, Thomas had stopped thinking about the city quite so often. Oh, the curiosity was still there, the sense that he was missing something by staying. But it had transformed from an urgent need into a distant possibility, something he might explore someday, rather than something he had to do immediately. He found himself noticing things he'd never paid attention to before. The way certain clouds meant rain within 3 days. The subtle shift in animal behavior that indicated a predator nearby. The plants that could heal and the plants that could kill, often growing side by side, distinguished only by those who knew where to look. Jim taught him about water, that most precious resource in the desert. They spent a week cleaning and maintaining the wells, and the old man explained the geology beneath their feet, how ancient seas had left deposits of underground water that meant the difference between life and death. "This well your grandmother and I dug in 1880, Jim said, peering down into the dark shaft. Took us 2 months of back-breaking work. Every day we'd lower buckets and haul up dirt and rock,
Kaya worked as hard as I did, maybe harder. Her people had been finding water in this desert for thousands of years. She knew things about underground streams that white settlers hadn't figured out yet. Thomas helped lower the bucket for cleaning, the rope rough against his palms. We hit water at 42 feet. I wanted to stop there, start using it right away. But Kaya said no, said we needed to go deeper, to the older water that wouldn't dry up in drought years. So we kept digging another 8 feet, down to 50, and she was right. That well has never gone dry, not even in the terrible drought of 1902, when half the ranches in the territory lost their livestock. The old man's expression grew contemplative. That's another thing I learned from her. Short-term thinking leads to long-term problems. You've got to look ahead, plan for the bad years when times are good. Store water, save money, build reserves. Don't assume tomorrow will be easy just because today is. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that comes when two people are aligned in purpose. Thomas found he didn't mind the hard labor anymore. Somewhere along the way, it had stopped feeling like obligation and started feeling like contribution, like he was maintaining something important rather than just completing assigned tasks. One evening in the 6th month, as they sat on the porch watching the sun paint the western sky in shades of orange and purple, Jim handed Thomas a worn leather journal. "Your grandmother kept a diary," the old man said. "Started it the year we met. Wrote in it almost every day for 40 years. I want you to read it. Not all at once. Take your time. Let her words speak to you directly." Thomas opened the journal carefully, the leather soft with age. The first page bore a date, September 15th, 1876. The handwriting was careful, precise, the English sometimes awkward, but always clear. "Today I chose not to kill a white man. I do not know if this choice is wisdom or weakness. My knife was at his throat. One motion, and my promise to Nolan would be kept. But something in his eyes stopped me. Not fear, acceptance, as if he understood the debt and was willing to pay it. This troubles me. I have learned to expect cowardice or rage from white men. I do not know what to do with quiet courage." Thomas looked up at his grandfather, who was staring at the sunset with eyes that saw beyond the visible. "Keep reading," Jim said softly. "She wrote about everything, the good days and the terrible ones, the times she doubted me and the times I failed her, the moments of joy and the periods of grief. All of it, honest and unfiltered. It's the most precious thing she left behind, aside from our children." Over the following weeks, Thomas read the journal in segments, rationing it like precious water. He learned about his grandmother not as a figure in his grandfather's stories, but as a woman with her own voice, her own perspective, her own struggles. She wrote about the early days of her marriage, the difficulty of merging two completely different worldviews. She wrote about the prejudice they faced from both Apache and white communities, the way people questioned their choices and doubted their commitment. She wrote about losing children, 2 pregnancies that ended in heartbreak before the 3 who survived. But she also wrote about triumph, about small victories and large ones, about the day Jim earned the respect of the full Apache Council, about teaching their children to honor both their heritages, about building a ranch that became a meeting ground for people who had every reason to hate each other but chose differently. One entry, dated July 4, 1889, struck Thomas with particular force. "Jim asked me today if I have regrets, if I wish I had chosen differently, married within my people, lived a simpler life. I told him the truth. I regret nothing. Yes, this path has been hard. Yes, we have faced hatred and isolation. Yes, there are days when the weight feels too heavy. But I wake up every morning next to a man who sees me as equal, who learns from me as I learn from him, who fights beside me, not for me. How many women can say that? How many people of any kind find a partner who makes them better simply by existing? I would choose him again, every time, without hesitation. Thomas closed the journal, his eyes burning with unshed tears. His grandfather sat silent beside him, giving him space to process. "She really loved you," Thomas said finally. "And I really loved her," Jim replied. "Still do. Death doesn't end that, just changes how you express it." The old man stood, stretching his back. "That's what I want you to understand, Thomas. Real love isn't the easy feeling you get at the beginning. That's just attraction, chemistry, the body's way of pushing two people together. Real love is what comes after, when you see all of someone's flaws and choose them anyway. When you face hardship together and come out stronger. When you build something brick by brick, year by year, that couldn't exist without both of you contributing." Jim walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the land they'd been working all day. "Your grandmother and I had 44 years together. We fought sometimes. We disagreed often. We hurt each other's feelings more times than I can count. But we never gave up on each other. Never stopped choosing each other, even when choosing something else would have been easier." Thomas joined his grandfather at the railing, the bracelet on his wrist catching the last rays of sunlight. "Is that what you want for me? To find someone like grandmother?" "I want you to find someone who makes you want to be better," Jim said. "Someone who challenges you and supports you in equal measure. Someone you'd fight for, build for, sacrifice for. The rest, the details of who they are or where they come from, that matters far less than the quality of their character and the depth of their commitment." A coyote called in the distance, its howl lonely and wild. "But first," the old man continued, "you need to know who you are, what you stand for, what you're willing to fight to protect. That's why this year matters, Thomas. Not to trap you here, but to give you a foundation solid enough to build on, no matter where life takes you." The sun dipped below the horizon, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees in minutes. The desert's way of reminding humans they were visitors in a place that played by different rules. 6 months down, Jim said. 6 to go. You learning what you need to know? Thomas thought about the calluses on his hands, the strength in his back, the knowledge accumulating in his mind. But more than that, he thought about the shift happening inside him, the way he saw the world differently now, the way he understood that value came in forms beyond money and status. "I'm learning," he said honestly. "Still not sure what it all means, but I'm learning." "That's enough," Jim said. "Understanding comes later. First, you just have to be willing to learn." They went inside as stars began appearing in the darkening sky, millions of them, more than Thomas had ever noticed in all his years living under them. The desert night wrapped around the ranch house like a blanket, protective and familiar. In his room later, Thomas opened the journal again, reading by lamplight. His grandmother's words reached across the decades, teaching him things no one else could say in quite the same way. "The land will break you if you fight it," she had written. "But if you learn to work with it, to respect its rhythms and honor its limits, it will sustain you through anything." Jim and I have survived droughts and floods, sickness and loss, poverty and plenty. We survive because we learned to bend instead of break, to adapt instead of insist, to listen to what the land and each other are telling us, even when the message is hard to hear. Thomas fell asleep with the journal on his chest,
his dreams filled with images of a young Apache woman and a lost cowboy building something impossible against odds that should have destroyed them. Building it anyway, making it last, proving that some things are worth fighting for, worth staying for, worth dedicating a life to protecting. The bracelet on his wrist caught the moonlight streaming through the window, black hair woven with care by hands that had held both weapons and healing herbs, that had chosen mercy over vengeance, that had built a legacy stronger than stone. Outside, the land waited patient and eternal, holding stories in every shadow, wisdom in every stone, lessons in every dawn that followed the darkness. And one young man slept, learning in his dreams what his waking mind was still struggling to accept. That home isn't where you're born, it's where you choose to plant your roots and tend them with care. The first snowfall came in late November, unusual for Arizona, but not unheard of. Thomas woke to find the world transformed, the familiar landscape softened under a thin blanket of white that would be gone by noon, but was magical while it lasted.
He found his grandfather already up, standing at the kitchen window with his coffee, watching the snow fall, with an expression Thomas couldn't quite read. Something between wonder and melancholy. She loved the snow, Jim said without turning around. Every time it fell, she'd stand outside with her face turned up to the sky, catching flakes on her tongue like a child. Said snow was the sky's way of blessing the earth, covering the scars, and giving everything a fresh start. Thomas poured his own coffee, joining his grandfather at the window. The first snow after we were married, I woke up to find her gone from our bed, panicked, thinking something was wrong. But then I looked outside and saw her dancing, actually dancing, spinning in circles with her arms spread wide, laughing like I'd never heard her laugh before. Jim's voice carried the weight of memory, sweet and painful in equal measure. I asked her later what had made her so happy. She said for the first time in years, she felt light. Said grief had been weighing her down for so long, she'd forgotten what joy felt like. But that morning, watching the snow fall, knowing she had someone to share it with, she remembered. The old man sipped his coffee, his eyes distant. That's when I understood something important, Thomas. Grief doesn't disappear. You don't get over losing people you love. But you can learn to carry it alongside joy, to make space for both, to honor your dead by living fully instead of dying slowly with them. Thomas watched the snow fall, understanding now why this particular weather touched his grandfather so deeply. It wasn't just snow. It was memory made visible, love made tangible, the past reaching into the present with gentle insistence. 9 months gone, Jim said, finally turning from the window. 3 to go. You still thinking about leaving when the year's up? Thomas considered the question honestly. The city still existed in his mind, still held possibilities he hadn't explored. But it felt different now, less like an escape and more like a choice among many. The urgency had faded, replaced by something more measured. I don't know yet, he admitted. Part of me still wants to see what's out there. But another part of me, a part that's gotten louder over these months, doesn't want to leave, doesn't want to walk away from what you're teaching me. Jim nodded slowly, as if this was the answer he'd expected. Your grandmother wrote something about that in her journal, near the end. Did you get that far yet? Thomas shook his head. He'd been reading slowly, savoring the entries,
not wanting to reach the final pages where sickness and death waited. She wrote that every person faces this choice at some point. The choice between the familiar and the unknown, between roots and wings. And she said the wise ones understand you don't have to choose one forever.
You can have seasons of exploration and seasons of staying. The trick is knowing which season you're in.
The old man set down his coffee cup with careful deliberation. I'm not going to tell you what to choose, Thomas. That defeats the whole purpose of this year. But I will tell you this. Whether you stay or go, you need to make the choice from strength, not fear. Don't stay because you're afraid of the unknown. Don't leave because you're afraid of commitment. Choose based on what your deepest self knows is right, even if your surface self is scared. Outside, the snow continued falling, each flake unique and temporary, beautiful in its brief existence. The months that followed were perhaps the richest of Thomas's year. With the basic skills mastered, Jim began teaching him subtler things. How to read people's intentions from their body language, how to negotiate fairly but firmly, how to stand up for what's right without making enemies unnecessarily.
They took a trip to town one day in January, and Thomas watched his grandfather interact with shopkeepers and neighbors. Some greeted Jim warmly, others with stiff politeness, a few with barely concealed hostility. The old man treated them all with the same quiet dignity, neither seeking approval nor flinching from disapproval. "You see that man who wouldn't shake my hand?" Jim asked as they drove home, the wagon loaded with supplies. "That's Carl Henderson. His father was at the battle where Kaya's brother died. Not the one who killed Nolan, but he was there. Carl grew up hearing his father talk about the Indian problem and how Apache should have been wiped out entirely." Thomas felt anger rising in his chest, but his grandfather's voice remained calm. "I could hate Carl for his father's beliefs, could refuse to do business with him, speak ill of him, make his life difficult. But what would that accomplish? His father's been dead 20 years. Carl's never done anything to me personally. He's just carrying his father's prejudice like an inherited disease he doesn't know how to cure." Jim guided the horses with practiced ease. "So I treat him with respect. Don't push myself on him, but don't avoid him either. Show him through my actions that his father's beliefs were wrong. Maybe he'll never change his mind, but maybe his children will. Maybe by treating him decently, despite his coldness, I'm planting seeds that'll grow in the next generation." The old man glanced at his grandson. "That's what your grandmother taught me. Long game thinking. You don't change the world in one conversation or one generation. You change it by living your values consistently, even when it's hard, even when no one's watching, even when the people you're being decent to don't deserve it." Thomas absorbed this lesson alongside all the others, understanding that his grandfather was teaching him not just how to ranch, but how to live. How to navigate a complicated world without losing your integrity or your humanity. In March, as the year approached its end, Jim took Thomas back to the cottonwood grove. The trees were beginning to bud, spring asserting itself against winter's retreat. They sat on a bench Jim had built years ago, positioned so you could see all 3 headstones. "Your grandmother and I used to come here every Sunday," Jim said. "Rain or shine, hot or cold. We'd sit right here and talk about the week, share our worries, our hopes, our plans. Then we'd spend time at each grave, telling Nolan and Taze about what was happening in our lives." The old man's weathered hands rested on his knees, patient and still. "After Kaya died, I kept coming, still do. Talk to all 3 of them like they're sitting here with me. Some people think that's foolish, talking to the dead. But I figure if we carry them in our hearts, if their influence shapes our choices,
then in a way they're not really dead at all. Thomas looked at his grandmother's headstone, at the dates that encompassed a life he'd only partially known. She'd died when he was 10, and his memories of her were fragments. The smell of sage and soap, the feeling of her hands braiding his hair, the sound of her singing in Apache, songs he didn't understand but found comforting. "I wish I'd known her better," Thomas said quietly. "Really known her, the way you did." "You know her through me," Jim replied. "Through the stories I've told, the journals she wrote, the values she lived by. And you know her through the land itself. Every fence post we've mended, every well we've maintained, every skill I've taught you, that's all Kaya. She's woven into this place as surely as her hair is woven into that bracelet on your wrist." A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals invisible to human eyes. "That's what legacy really means," Jim continued. "Not the things you leave behind, but the part of yourself that continues living through others. Through the people you taught, the lives you touched, the example you set. Your grandmother's been dead 2 years, but she's still teaching you, still shaping who you're becoming. That's immortality of the kind that matters." Thomas touched the bracelet, feeling the smooth texture of the woven hair, the connection it represented to a woman he'd barely known but was coming to understand. "The year's almost up," Jim said, his tone neutral, offering no pressure. 2 weeks from today, you'll have fulfilled your commitment. After that, the choice is yours. Stay or go. I'll support you either way. But before you decide, I want to show you one more thing." They stood and walked to the far edge of the property, where the land sloped upward toward a rocky outcrop. Thomas had been here before, but never paid much attention. It was just rough ground, difficult to farm or build on, seemingly without purpose. But Jim led him to a specific spot and pointed down. "This is where I'm going to be buried," the old man said simply. "I've already made the arrangements. When my time comes, they'll bring me here and lay me to rest facing east, so I can watch the sun rise every morning for eternity." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "I'm not telling you this to be morbid," Jim continued. "I'm telling you because you need to understand what you'd be taking on if you stay. This ranch won't run itself. The land needs constant attention, and when I'm gone, if you're not here, it'll pass to your uncles, who've already said they plan to sell it to developers." The old man's voice remained steady, factual. "They want to turn it into housing tracts, subdivisions, strip malls, all the things your grandmother and I fought to keep out. They have that right. It's their inheritance too. But it means everything we built, everything we protected, will be paved over and forgotten within a generation." Jim turned to face his grandson directly. "I'm not guilting you into staying. I'm just being honest about what's at stake. If you leave, you're not just choosing a different life for yourself. You're choosing a different fate for this land. And I need you to make that choice with full knowledge of the consequences." Thomas looked out over the property, seeing it now as his grandfather must see it. Not just acres and structures, but a living testament to two people who'd refused to accept the limitations the world placed on them, who'd built something impossible and sustained it through sheer determination and love. "How much time do you have?" Thomas asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. "Doctors say maybe 5 years if I'm lucky," Jim answered without flinching. "Heart's not what it used to be. But I've had 72 good years, Thomas, 44 of them with the woman I loved. I've got no complaints about the hand I was dealt." The old man placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder, the gesture carrying all the weight of their shared year. "But I would like to know this place will continue, that the story won't end with me, that someone will keep coming to that grove on Sundays to talk to Kaya and Nolan and Taze, keep their memories alive, keep teaching the next generation what they taught me. Thomas felt the full weight of the choice before him crystallize into clarity. This wasn't about ranch work versus city jobs. This wasn't about comfort versus adventure. This was about whether he would be the kind of man who built on what came before, or the kind who walked away to build something entirely his own. Neither choice was wrong, but only one felt right in a way he couldn't fully articulate but knew in his bones. "I need to tell you something," Thomas said, his voice stronger than he expected. "About 2 months ago, I wrote a letter to a company in Phoenix, applied for a job, got accepted. They're holding the position for me, waiting to hear if I'm coming." Jim's expression didn't change, but Thomas saw something flicker in his eyes. Not disappointment, understanding. "I was going to take it," Thomas continued. "Was all set to leave the day after our year was up. Had it all planned. But then something happened." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I was fixing the fence on the north pasture, the section grandmother wrote about in her journal. The one you let go too long that first year. And I was working on it, making sure every connection was solid, every wire properly tensioned. And I realized I wasn't doing it because you'd told me to. I was doing it because I cared. Because this fence matters. This land matters. The story of how it came to exist matters." Thomas met his grandfather's eyes directly. "I wrote them back last week, turned down the job, told them I had responsibilities here that I couldn't walk away from." Jim's face remained carefully neutral, but his hand on Thomas's shoulder tightened slightly. "You sure about this, boy? You're giving up a lot. Money, opportunities, the chance to see what else is out there." "I'm not giving up anything," Thomas said with conviction he hadn't known he possessed. "I'm choosing something. Choosing to be the kind of man who honors what came before, who protects what matters, who plants trees he might not live to see fully grown." The old man's eyes grew bright with moisture he didn't try to hide. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Hell, I'm proud. But I need you to know this isn't a trap. If you change your mind in a year or 5 years or 10, if you wake up one morning and realize this isn't the life you want, you can still leave. This choice isn't forever unless you choose to make it forever." Thomas shook his head. "I know what I'm choosing, Grandpa. I'm choosing to be your student for however many years we have left. To learn everything you can teach me. To become the kind of man who can carry this forward. And then, when my time comes, I'll teach my own children or grandchildren the same way. I'll tell them about you and grandmother, about Nolan and Tazai, about love that crosses boundaries, and courage that builds instead of destroys." Jim pulled his grandson into an embrace, the kind men of his generation rarely shared, the kind that said everything words couldn't capture. They stood like that for a long moment, 2 men on a hill, overlooking land that had seen so much history and would see more still. Below them, the ranch house sat solid and permanent, smoke rising from the chimney, life continuing in the rhythms established decades ago. "Come on," Jim said finally, stepping back and wiping his eyes unselfconsciously. "We've got work to do. Those cattle won't feed themselves, and there's a section of roof that needs attention before the spring rains come." They walked back down the hill together, grandfather and grandson, teacher and student, the past and the future linked by choice and commitment and love that refused to be bound by blood alone. That evening, Thomas wrote in his own journal, starting a record that would someday be read by children not yet born. "Today I chose to stay," he wrote. "Not because I had to, because I wanted to. Because some stories are worth continuing. Because some lessons take a lifetime to learn. Because home isn't where you run from. It's what you run toward when you finally understand what matters. He paused, then added one more line. Grandmother, I hope I make you proud. I'm going to try. 5 years later. Thomas stood alone in the cottonwood grove, his weathered hands resting on the newest headstone.
The granite was still bright, the letters freshly carved. James Thornton, 1848 to 1925. Cowboy, husband, teacher. He chose love over loneliness. The old man had lived just long enough to see Thomas marry Sarah, a schoolteacher from town who'd fallen in love not with the ranch, but with the man who protected it. Jim had smiled at their wedding, whispered to Thomas, "She has Kaya's eyes, curious and brave." Thomas touched the bracelet on his wrist, then knelt and placed fresh sage on all 4 graves: Nolan, Taze, Kaya, Jim. The 4 pillars of a story that had shaped his entire life. Behind him, footsteps approached. Sarah, carrying their infant son. "Telling them the news?" she asked softly. Thomas stood, taking his son in his arms. The boy had Kaya's dark hair, Jim's bright eyes. "His name," Thomas said, looking at the graves, "we'll call him James Nolan Thornton." Sarah smiled. "Your grandfather would have loved that." "He knows," Thomas said, certain. "They all know." The wind moved through the cottonwoods, and for a moment Thomas could have sworn he heard laughter. 4 voices, different generations, blending into one. The story wasn't ending. It was just beginning again. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, indifferent to human concerns, but beautiful all the same. The land settled into night, patient and enduring, waiting for tomorrow's dawn when the work would begin again. And in a grove of cottonwood trees, 3 simple headstones stood watch, silent witnesses to a story that had begun with violence and ended with love, that had started with division and concluded with unity, that had seemed impossible but had become real through the simple act of choosing it every single day. The bracelet on Thomas's wrist caught the lamplight as he wrote, black hair woven with care by hands long gone but never forgotten, binding past to present to future in an unbroken circle that would continue as long as someone chose to honor it, as long as someone stayed to carry it forward, as long as love proved stronger than death itself.